Welcome back, beautiful people. This is the continuation of my twin sister seduced me to sleep with her. Taio barely made it to the toilet before her stomach gave in. Bending over the sink, she started retching and vomiting violently, her body trembling as she emptied the contents of her stomach. The bitter taste made her gag even more, and tears stung her eyes as the pain in her stomach increased. She coughed, spitting out the last bits of bitter liquid. Her vision blurred slightly, and a cold sweat covered her forehead. A firm but gentle hand suddenly touched her shoulder. "What is wrong?" a voice asked from behind. Taio flinched slightly at the unexpected touch. She turned her head weakly and saw her mother, Wana, staring at her with a worried look. "Taio, what is wrong with you?" Wana repeated. "Why are you vomiting so hard?" Taio forced a weak smile and shook her head. "I'm fine, Mom," she replied weakly. "It's just a little stomach upset." Wana frowned, not convinced by her response. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Mom, I just need to rest," Taio insisted, trying to stand up. But her legs became unsteady and weak. Wana stepped aside and stood up. "Go inside and take some stomach tablets. They're on the table in the parlor," she said firmly. "No, Mom, I think I'm all right now," Taio said quickly, waving a hand dismissively. She took a few shaky steps forward, but suddenly her body gave way, her knees buckled, and before she could stop herself, she collapsed onto the floor. A choked gasp escaped her lips as she kept vomiting some liquid substance from her mouth. Wana's heart jumped in fear. "Taio," she screamed as she rushed to lift her up. Her hands trembled as she held her daughter's weak, limp body. The sound of Wana's panic scream echoed through the house. Within seconds, Frank and Kahindi rushed out from the dining room, their eyes wide with alarm. "Mom, what's wrong?" Kahindi asked in a shaky voice, his heart pounding as he took in the sight of his twin sister lying helplessly on the floor. Taio, what's happening to her?" Frank asked authoritatively. Wana shook her head frantically. "I don't know. She was vomiting the food she ate earlier, then suddenly slumped," Wana explained. Frank ran a hand over his head, pacing in distress. "This is serious. We need to take her to the hospital immediately," he said. Taio groaned weakly, forcing her heavy mouth open. "No, Dad, I don't want to see a doctor," she murmured. "I told you I'm fine. It's just a little stomach upset, probably because of the excess food I ate last night." Frank and Wana exchanged worried glances. Kahindi, who had been standing silently, couldn't take his eyes off his sister. He had never seen her this week before, and it scared him. Frank exhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. "All right, then," he finally said. "She should go and lie on the bed. Let's see if she regains her strength." He carefully lifted Taio into his arms and carried her to the bedroom. Wana followed closely behind, still feeling uneasy. Kahindi remained speechless by the doorway, watching as his sister was gently carried into the bedroom. A few days after Taio's sudden illness, her behavior started changing gradually. She did not go to school that day. Frank told Wana to allow her to stay at home until she fully recovered. Wana prepared breakfast for her and went to her room to wake her up to come to the dining room for her breakfast. Taio walked sluggishly into the dining room, her movements slow and careful. She had been feeling better over the past few days, though there was still an unusual tiredness about her. She pulled out a chair and sat down, waiting as her mother served her meal. But the moment the plate was placed before her, her reaction changed. The smell of the food, which had always been her favorite, suddenly became unbearable. A wave of nausea hit her, her stomach twisted violently, and she pushed the plate away. Wana frowned, watching her daughter with quiet concern. "Taio, you barely eat your food since you recovered. Your loss of appetite is becoming more noticeable. You don't want to eat?" Wana asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Taio shook her head quickly. "I don't have an appetite, Mom," she replied as her face went pale. "I would just have juice instead," she said as she stood up from the dining table and headed over to the fridge to pick an orange juice, after which she went to the living room and turned on the TV. Wana stood frozen for a moment, her grip tightening around the edge of the table. A strange thought crossed her mind, but she quickly shook it off. That night, Frank got home from work very tired and went to sleep as soon as he finished eating his food. As he lay in bed that night, His mind was half asleep when he heard a faint sound from the living room. His eyes fluttered open. At first, he thought he imagined it, but then he heard the sound of slow, careful footsteps. He turned slightly, expecting to see Wana shifting in bed, but she was still asleep beside him. The footsteps continued, soft but noticeable. Frank rose from the bed and stepped out of the room. He went to the living room and saw Taio sitting on the couch, trying to turn on the television in the middle of the night. Frank hesitated before speaking. "Taio," he said. She turned sharply, startled for a brief moment. A look of fear flashed across her face before she quickly masked it. "You should be sleeping," Frank said with a calm but firm voice. "I couldn't," she murmured. "I was unable to." Frank watched her closely. There was something unsettling about her, but he couldn't seem to figure out what could be wrong. "But it's midnight. You aren't supposed to be watching a movie by this time," Frank queried. Taio didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at her father as if urging him to allow her to watch the TV. "All right, don't stay too long," Frank finally said after what seemed like ages. "And don't forget to turn off the TV after you are done," Frank warned. "Thank you, Dad. I won't stay too long," she murmured, clinging to the blanket she took with her. Frank headed back to the bedroom, and Taio wrapped the blanket around herself and proceeded to watch the movie. It was Sunday morning, and the family was getting ready for church, the usual routine filling the house with movement and quiet conversation. Taio stood before the mirror, adjusting her dress, but something felt wrong. The way the dress looked on her body made her uncomfortable. She suddenly felt a slight rumbling in her stomach and a sharp pain shoot through her chest. She winced a little, and her hand hesitated over her stomach. She suddenly felt a wave of frustration inside her. Her chest tightened, and without thinking, she grabbed a scarf from the dresser and flung it across the room. Wana, who had been passing by, stopped at the doorway. "Taio," she called. Taio stiffened. She hadn't heard her mother approach. Quickly, she bent down to pick up the scarf, but her hands were shaking. "Are you okay?" Wana asked, stepping closer. "Yes," Taio replied too quickly. "I'm fine." "All right, dress up quick and meet us outside," Wana told her as she walked outside. A few minutes later, they all left for church. The next morning, which was Monday, Wana stepped into the children's room to wake the kids up and prepare them for school. She moved toward the bed, gently shaking Cindy's shoulder first. He groaned sleepily, turning to the side before slowly sitting up with a small yawn. He stretched and rubbed his eyes. "Good morning, Mom," he mumbled. "Good morning, my dear," Wana replied with a small smile before turning toward Taio's bed. But her smile faded slowly when she saw her. Taio was still lying down, curled up under the blanket. The sheets were slightly damp, and sweat beads covered her forehead. Her chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths, and her face was unusually pale. Wana's heart clenched. She reached out and placed a hand on Taio's forehead. The warmth that greeted her fingers was alarming. "Taio," Wana called, her voice laced with concern. "What is wrong with you?" Taio's eyes fluttered open, drowsy and unfocused. She forced a weak smile, shifting slightly under the blanket. "I'm fine, Mom, just a little tired," Taio said. Wana frowned, pressing the back of her hand to Taio's cheek. The heat radiating from her skin was undeniable. "You are not fine," Wana said firmly. "You are sweating, and your body is too hot. Tell me the truth." Taio groaned softly, shutting her eyes. "It's nothing, Mom. Maybe I just didn't sleep well." Wana wasn't convinced. She reached for Taio's hand, gently squeezing it. "You were vomiting days ago, always sleeping, and now you're running a fever. Don't tell me it's nothing." Kahindi, who had been listening quietly, looked over at his sister with concern. "Taio, if you're sick, you should rest. Maybe Mom should take you to the hospital." At the mention of the hospital, Taio's eyes snapped open. She sat up quickly, but the sudden movement made her dizzy. "No, I don't need a doctor. I'll be fine," she said, shaking her head. Wana narrowed her eyes, watching her daughter carefully. There was something odd about her insistence. "Taio, you haven't been eating much, you're weak, and now you're running a fever. This is not something we can ignore," Wana said sternly. I swear, Mom, I'll be okay. Maybe I just need some rest, Taio pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. Wana let out a deep sigh. She sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over Taio's damp forehead. The heat was making her worry even more. She looked at Kahindi. Go and bring a bowl of cool water and a towel, she instructed. Kahindi nodded quickly and rushed out of the room. Wana turned back to Taio, brushing a few strands of hair from her sweaty face. My daughter, I know when something is wrong, Wana said softly. I don't want you hiding anything from me. Taio forced another smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I promise, Mom, I'm just a little weak. Wana said again, there's no use arguing for now, but deep down, I'm not convinced. And suddenly, the thought she had been pushing away came rushing back, filling her with unease. Something isn't right with Taio. This wasn't just a stomach upset. It is more than that. Taio has been hiding something from me. Many thoughts ran through Wana's mind, and they made her uncomfortable. Wana's mind raced as she thought about the past few weeks. Then she recalled a wild occurrence. She had accidentally met Taio clothless twice in the presence of her husband without asking questions. At the time, she had dismissed it, thinking little of it, not wanting to be overly suspicious. But now, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her head to face Taio. She had to ask. She had to hear it from Taio's mouth. With a deep, shaky breath, she finally gathered the courage. Taio, Wana's voice was barely above a whisper, are you pregnant? Taio's eyes snapped open, a look of pure shock washing over her face. Pregnant? Her lips trembled as she sat up slowly, staring at her mother in disbelief. Mom, why would you say such a thing? Her voice cracked, laced with frustration. Why would you think I'm pregnant? Wana couldn't find the words to explain her suspicions. Her throat felt dry. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand shaking as tears welled up in her eyes. She could feel her heartbeat pounding loudly in her chest. Taio's breathing became uneven. She felt a deep sense of humiliation as she shook her head. Mom, have you ever seen me with a boy? Who exactly do you think would get me pregnant? Taio remained silent, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Wana was lost in thought, remembering those moments when she ignored her instincts. Then a cold, terrifying thought crossed her mind. Frank, don't do this to our only daughter, she clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. If I find out that my husband is responsible for this, I will never forgive him, she whispered within herself. When it was daybreak and Taio's fever hadn't gone down, Frank decided to take action without letting Taio know. He left the house and returned shortly with their family doctor. Wana, who had been pacing the living room anxiously, felt a lump form in her throat when she saw the doctor step inside. Kahindi followed closely behind, his face filled with worry. Frank wasted no time. Doc, my daughter has been acting strange for the past 3 weeks. I don't know what's wrong with her. She's been complaining about stomach pains, Wana added. We've been giving her medicine, but there's no improvement. The doctor frowned. 3 weeks, you say? Yes, sir, Frank responded. She keeps vomiting, always feeling tired, and she barely eats. The doctor sighed. It's obvious that your daughter is pregnant. A sharp gasp filled the air. Frank's eyes widened in disbelief. Pregnant? Wana staggered back as if she had been physically struck. Pregnant, she screamed, her voice filled with pain. Kahindi felt his legs weaken beneath him, his hands trembling at his sides. Taio's breath caught in her throat, and her vision blurred with tears. No, no, doctor, that can't be true, Taio shouted, shaking her head violently. I am not pregnant. The doctor said, his voice calm yet firm, I'm sorry, little girl, but you cannot teach me my job. Wana couldn't hold back anymore. She let out a wail of pain, slowly sinking to the floor as tears poured down her face. She lifted her head, her eyes filled with anger and grief. Her voice came out in a broken whisper filled with desperation. Who impregnated you, Taio? Taio sobbed uncontrollably, her hand shaking as she turned to face her father. Frank stood frozen, his face blank, and his eyes darkened with an unreadable emotion. Taio's gaze lingered on him. Wana followed her daughter's eyes and slowly turned toward Frank. The room fell into an eerie silence. Wana's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding violently against her chest as her trembling fingers pointed towards Frank. No, no, this can't be true, she wailed, staggering forward. Frank, don't tell me you have a hand in this. Don't tell me you. Her voice broke as fresh sobs ran their way down her cheeks. Don't tell me you impregnated your own daughter. Frank's face twisted in shock, his mouth opened, but no words came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky, laced with desperation. I don't know what you're trying to say, he stammered, shaking his head frantically. Taio is my daughter. I would never do such a thing. Wana's eyes burned with fury. Who is telling the truth between you both? She shouted, looking at Frank. She is looking at you. That means you're responsible, and now you stand there pretending to be innocent. Kahindi, who had been silent all along, felt his legs weaken beneath him, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He leaned against the wall, unable to support his own weight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Frank turned to Wana, his face pleading. Honey, I swear to you, I don't know anything about this. I'm not responsible for her. A sharp slap cut his sentence short. The sound echoed through the room like thunder. Shut up. Wana screamed. Shut your filthy mouth. I don't believe any of you right now. Her hands flew to her head, fingers gripping her hair in frustration. She turned back to her daughter, Taio. Who is responsible for this pregnancy? Taio swallowed hard, her body trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks as she muttered a single word, Dad. Frank staggered backward. What did I do? Frank said, defending himself. Dad, if only you cautioned us, if only you had corrected me, Taio sobbed. If only you disciplined me, this wouldn't have happened. Wana's eyes narrowed with confusion. I don't understand. What are you saying? Frank's face twisted in frustration. Stop speaking in riddles. Taio hit the hammer on the nail. Taio took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, if only you had punished Kahindi and me when you caught us having an affair. The room fell into a deafening silence. Wana's hands dropped to her sides. Cindy's breath hitched, his body stiffening in fear. Frank stood frozen, his eyes widening in horror. Wana blinked rapidly. What did you just say? Taio sobbed harder. You caught us countless times, but instead of disciplining us, you just talked softly and let us go, her voice cracked as she continued. You exposed us to things we were too young to understand. You and Mom never hid your intimacy from us. We witnessed you getting intimate countless times, even when we were in the room with you, and we thought it was something normal, something legal we can practice. Kahindi lowered his head in shame. We were just curious at first, but when Mom became suspicious, we wanted to stop, his voice trembled. But we were already addicted to it. We are sorry. Please forgive us. I don't know it will result in this, Kahindi said, feeling remorseful. Wana stumbled backward, her legs almost giving way beneath her. A sickening wave of realization crashed over her. Her heart shattered into a million pieces. Frank dropped to his knees, his body trembling as he covered his face with his hands. His voice came out in a whisper, This is my fault. I failed as a father. I failed you both. Tears rolled down Wana's cheeks. I should have seen the signs, she muttered. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked questions instead of trusting blindly. The doctor, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. We will be stopping here now. Kindly like, subscribe and comment your opinion on this. We will be dropping the final part this week. Stay tuned. I love you here.